Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I remember last year around this time, I talked a little bit about other work I've been doing around lesson planning in XR for one of these webinars, which was really great. And at the time, I was at the University of Glasgow, and now I'm in the University of Exeter, so all the way down south. It's a little bit warmer, which is nice. So today, I'll be talking about something that was in development for a while, and I think now it's kind of we're in the place where we can talk about uh, the whole development of this course and how it changed over time. So it's teaching about virtual reality, not only with virtual reality. So it's about the designing of interdisciplinary XR pedagogy, and it's for psychology students specifically. I teach psychology. I'm a social lecturer in psychology department, mostly teaching cognition, and this virtual reality module. And a lot of my work is around neurodiversity and accessibility. Um, I put this sort of AI generated action figure, which were popular for a while ago. I don't know if you remember, guys, because I think it nicely encapsulates my love for cats, my love for inclusion, technology, and I'm also Lithuanian, so never forget, the roots of where I come from. So I always like to make sure my materials are accessible. So slides are all available on my OSF page, which is I normally have that open somewhere. So it's where I have all of my presentations and teaching resources, which you can use with acknowledgement, of course. And there's a lot of presentations and posters and things there. And this presentation will be there. And I'll share my website with a lot of additional information at the end as well. So you can use that. So before I sort of kick off, I thought it'd be a good idea to begin by sort of situating where I am. I suppose not necessarily everyone knows who I am or what I do. So I thought I'll just start with this. So I started my PhD in 2017-ish, University of Glasgow. And it was around neurodiversity and the use of virtual reality to understand perceptual differences, mostly through drawing and arts-based therapy, person-centric approaches. So it's sort of very much mixed methods work. And at the same time, my PhD was industry funded via the company Edify, which created teaching software for virtual reality. So that's how I ended up getting involved with immersive education and immersive learning research network, where I became opportunities and inclusion chair. I think it was 2022, but I feel like I've been quite a while, and I very much enjoy every time joining the conference and try to support the conference around the accessibility elements, but also reporting some of the stuff we're doing. And now I got a permanent position, and now I'm in the University of Exeter. So some of the work I'll be talking about will be from Glasgow, and then I'll talk about how we transitioned into Exeter to translate the same course into a different system slightly. In terms of the work that Glasgow has been doing, I think I talked in some previous webinars, it's really exciting. So it started around the same time my PhD started, was with Project Mobius, which was a large project creating these teaching labs where Edify apps can be used. Then it led into the ArcXR to be established, which is the sort of research space alongside the teaching space. And I was on the strategy board for that before I left, and an organizational board as well. And then Meta sponsored some of our policy papers. So one of them is available through the ArcXR website, which is now called RIG, which is officially now a center rather than just the research group. And we're working on some work at the moment, also sponsored by Meta's Learning Fund. And we're putting together some sort of frameworks around assessing efficacy of virtual reality. But that's all the work around how we teach in virtual reality and how we understand whether it's effective or not. But the course I'm going to talk about is about how do you teach students about using virtual reality. So for a bit of a context, when I began working with VR, again, it was 2017. So I think we kind of, in terms of the Gartner cycle, for those, hopefully, I put some references for those who want to read up about it later on. In 2017, I think it was just hyping up. So at that time, we didn't have Oculus Quest. I started working HTC Vive, and the landscape was very different than what it is now. And most VR courses were situated in computer science or instructional design departments. And I was a psychologist. I didn't necessarily have enough technical knowledge of virtual reality, although my work in undergraduate degree was around stereo vision. That certainly helped, but even so, there was quite a steep learning curve. And only very few addressed VR as a research tool for psychology. And ever since then, we had this sort of peak of inflated expectations. And I think we kind of had the disillusionment and slope of enlightenment. I think this is where we are kind of at the moment, because AI has taken over with its own Gartner cycle. So with VR VR research in psychology continued to expand, but by talking to researchers and educators in this space, it was very evident what an uphill battle it is for anyone who wants to undertake virtual reality research and how much upskilling they need to do. And it's a steep learning curve. So then I took this sort of my own learning journey, I guess, that happened through this sort of Gartner cycle. And I tried to align it to develop a course, because I thought, well, if I needed sort of to teach myself this, and based on a lot of conversations I had with others, I realized that probably it would be useful to have a course for psychologists who are interested in this new technology or might not be even aware of how VR can be used for research. And this sort of my own insight essentially mapped out onto the structure of the course, and that's how we mapped it out. So I made this little infographic. When you have the slides, you can look into it in a little bit more detail. So I essentially just took out my own learning journey and then kind of structured the pedagogical elements of the course. So we had to establish foundations in shared language. Shared language is one of the elements that are really particularly important when you teach anything interdisciplinary, because computer scientists might have completely different phraseology than psychologists. We also had some philosophers doing virtual reality research. They have a slightly different approach. So that was the first stage that I kind of wanted the students to get introduced to. Then, given that a lot of research in virtual reality and psychology is quite fragmented, and psychology can be quite fragmented in its own little disciplines, so these sort of case studies and industry perspectives would have been quite useful, and that's what we adapted. And I'll talk a little bit about the benefits and the negatives of having these individual case studies. Then some sort of experiential VR practice would be needed as a third step. So once there's theoretical basis, students do need to try VR and actually compare different headsets, different technology to get a sense of what it's like. And then some sort of integrative approach. So in the first iterations, I'll talk you through, we had a research design project, and we still had it in the new version of the course in Exeter, but I'm going to sort of slightly amend it for next year, and I'll talk you through it. And then there's a lot of cross-cutting scaffolding supports that I'm going to briefly mention, because a lot of them are around accessibility considerations and very simple things you can do in any teaching scenario, in person or online, to make sure that students are fully supported. And it's one of those universal design sort of principles that a lot of these benefit anybody, not necessarily students with specific support needs. So it started actually initially as only a 10-week CPD course that I put together as a proposal. And then my supervisor, David Simmons, who was in psychology at the time, was in process of putting this through as a master's module. And then as I came on board as staff at the School of Psychology and Neuroscience in Glasgow, we co-led the first iteration of the course, which was master's course. So the CPD course never ended up running because with evening courses, they're always reliant on recruitment of students, and we just didn't have enough. Where the master's course was quite small, we ended up having about 10 to 15 students, but it first ran in 2022-23 academic year. And at the time, as far as I am aware, was one of the only UK modules at the time around VR for psychology, alongside University of Reading's Brain and Virtual Reality seminar module. So it's quite nice. Now looking back, I was much more aware that that was the only one, and the second one, I suppose. But it just again indicated how something like this was needed, and there was clearly a niche. So again, this is sort of just already sort of restating things I already said in the previous slide about following those 4 kind of key steps, I guess. Establishing foundations, interdisciplinary case studies, and VR practical sessions and integrative research design and some sort of work, whether it's a workshop or a group work. That sort of those 2 latter ones were aimed to integrate the sort of foundational knowledge they get and through the different case studies. So this was in actually the structure. It's the wrong year I got, so my bad. So this was a different year, but this was essentially what initial structure looked like. And these are some examples of our students using virtual reality. This is the teaching lab, and this is like research lab. So again, initial ones were students introduced to what is VR, what technology of VR, and then in week 3 and 4, given that David's work and my work was very heavily focused around VR and neurodiversity, we focused a lot of that on that work. And given that some of the previous modules where we had lots of guest lecturers, I tried to keep it very focused, where I deliver most of the content out of only some guest lecturers, and to kind of have a good balance, because too many guest lecturers might be confusing for students. So I ended up delivering quite like a large portion, about maybe 30% of this, and with David and myself, again, splitting some of the work. And then the workshops in the teaching labs were delivered by us together, and the same as the workshop at the end, which was designing the experiment in the end. So some challenges emerged immediately because this is the first time we were running this. So students without any computer science background struggled most with some technical foundations. But again, I always re-emphasize, this comes up every time I ran this course. The sort of second week that you have the technology of VR, it's very basic, just mentioning essentially every headset that's kind of around and the software, Unity and Unreal, just to make sure the students are aware of these terms. But even that in itself was quite a lot for a lot of students. So, but I keep just sort of telling them that, like, if they do read papers on virtual reality, some of this knowledge is crucial. So it's one of those lectures that perhaps less interactive, but at the moment, as far as it's just one of those lectures, you just have to get through it. It's not going to be as interactive as others. So VR technologies do evolve quickly, so it's really important that students are up to date with the terminology and they can assess and critically evaluate the literature that's coming out. So this is where the historical and technical context is so important. This is where we realized that a lot of the time we were relying on just a collection of research papers, which was limited in coherence. So students were already struggling with this quite interdisciplinary course where they had to do a lot of piecing information together. And then on top of that, they had just a ton of papers to work with. And then as a result, that's why we made some changes in the second iteration of the course. And this was the table of contents of the Moodle textbook that I initially put together. So before, I thought I'll put this eventually open source, and it is now, and I'll share a link after. But initially, it was just sort of very broad structure of how I could envision the textbook. There are a few textbooks out there, but the ones that exist are mostly either based in computer science or instructional design. And for psychology students, they have a necessary level of detail because they're not going to be building models, or they're going to need very little knowledge, and they might be able to build something by themselves if they wish, but there's a lot of already open source resources and apps that they can use for psychology experiments. So the technicality that exists in some textbook is not necessarily relevant for someone who's just trying to learn about virtual reality as a research tool. So we also strengthened the scaffolding. So I started introducing weekly MCQs. So it's again, I'm going to highlight some of the very simple pedagogical elements that you can introduce into any course you run, and it's quite useful. So that helped me identify some misconceptions. So maybe where students were getting terminology wrong. And again, the sort of textbook became sort of clearly valuable for students. And the interactivity of VR is always going to generate some positive feedback, which is good. And but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of how we can sort of link this interdisciplinary branches together. So these are some examples. They're quite small. So we used also a collaborative mind map. So in some cases, I used either Miro. Now I started using Lucidchart. You normally judge it by the cohort, how interactive they are with the online tools. So this is an example of Miro. It's quite small, but in some cases, like this cohort I'm working with now, they did better with sort of whiteboards in one of the practical sessions where they sort of info dumped a bunch of the things that they learned. In other cohorts, they like the sort of structure of every week I just load up the mind map and we build it together. And I've done this in other courses in psychology outside of XR and technology, and it's actually quite an effective way to make sure that students are kind of keeping on top of their reading, or at least they're trying to. And this is just an example of, on Moodle or a variation of the Moodle, or these sort of learning environments, they're all quite similar. You normally have a quiz option where you can create quizzes, and then you can check how students answer. So you can check where they make most mistakes or errors, and you can see, sort of identify the questions where they scored lower. And that would be actually was a nice way for me to identify where some clarification is needed. Because I set up these MCQs, which were, again, I generated a lot of these using AI, which again is an easier way. But then you also sort of pick the ones that are useful and where maybe you want to check students' knowledge. So, for example, how well they understand divergence and accommodation conflict of a head-mounted displays, or maybe how well they understand what is XR in terms of comparison to VR or AR. So student feedback in this case was good. It was always nice to get saying excellent course leads, good assessment methods. Some do still find like 2-hour lecture sessions long. In Glasgow, we had only one big assessment, so that was quite difficult. But having too many assessments is another downfall, which we'll come to, which in Exeter we have the opposite problem. But overall, they did enjoy the course, which is always nice to see. So then beyond that, there's expansion of the module beyond Glasgow. So I left Glasgow at the start of this year. And this is actually, for those who have been in Glasgow, you might think this is a Glasgow university, but actually it's another Gothic building, and this is in Exeter. This is Exeter Cathedral. So just to throw you a little bit. This is not Glasgow. So the Glasgow course is continuing now, where David is continuing to run the course the way it was structured. And I think they have someone new to help David to run this. And I brought this course over to Exeter, where we wanted to ensure that it runs this academic year. And literally this week is the last week, so we still have a revision session to do on Friday, where we just finished running this. And then Matthew Coxon's team and York St. John also started to run the course on VR and psychology. I think it's called something different for the final year students, which was great to see that there's clearly expansion of this interest in psychology and virtual reality. I'm sure there's examples of this outside of the UK, but I kind of just did the research only on the UK-based courses. And me and Matthew were trying to see if maybe next year we can work on the open source textbook together. And I'll share the link to the textbook. So what did I do? So I had to adapt. I said level 4 undergraduates. It's level 3 undergraduates. I always get mixed up still, because in Scotland we have you have 4 years of undergraduate, and in England you have 3 years of undergraduate. So I always think of final year students as level 4, but actually it's level 3 in Exeter. So still haven't been, not a bit less than a year since I moved back to England. So still mixing those up. So these are some of our students from the past few weeks where they were in VR lab we have here. It's a bit slightly different approach and setup of the lab than we had in Glasgow, but we still have, it's growing. And this is the structure of the Moodle equivalent we have, which is Exeter learning environment. But again, the principle is very similar. The cohort was larger this time, so we had to make sure that the whole infrastructure differed. So that I had to adapt this. The VR availability again was different, and new assessment structure. So instead of having one assignment, these guys had 3, which was group presentation, critical review, and an exam. So it was kind of almost over-assessing than under-assessing. And then I also added additional accessibility measures because in the department, we're trying to build more on accessibility, and additional sources were added to assist some students with individual learning plans, and actually again benefited everybody. And we had 12 weeks, so it wasn't 10 weeks like in Glasgow, so I had to expand some of the modules. The structure also differed, so allowed for hybrid teaching model. So we had an online lecture, which introduced sort of key concepts each week. And then while the in-person seminars, which were 2 hours, were more hands-on VR exploration and integration with more case-based learning. And I had quite a few guest lecturers. In this case, this time I included a colleague who was a UX designer in the industry, which was really interesting because UX is very intuitively psychologist. Essentially, any psychologist can be a user experience designer with a bit of upskilling. But it was interesting that a lot of students struggled with some of the UX terminology. And so again, it's very evident how these interdisciplinary courses are needed to show how psychology students what careers they can actually aspire to do outside of just counseling and research, with our sort of very standard pathways for psychology students. With AI and product design increasing, there's just so many more possibilities that psychology students can go on and do after graduation. And then this GitHub was set up. It's open source. There's an address here, but I can share it in the chat. It's very much work in progress. It's not the sort of the most sophisticated textbook on the planet. It uses a lot of external sources. I link lots of YouTube videos, which when I'm learning, I know that YouTube has always been useful. So I think for students, it's been useful as well. And I think they've been reading that textbook where appropriate. And again, we had some guest lecturers. Here, University of Exeter, we have a strong team around motor control embodiment research. So we had quite a lot of work around that, a lot of presentations around that. One of the key challenges was the group work. So because at this time, instead of running a workshop at the end where we kind of asked students to build on the practical elements that they learned, and then the more theoretical experimental design and constructed within the 2-hour workshop. This was an ongoing piece of work, and it was something that they submit alongside critical review halfway through the course. So I have to accommodate some of about an hour each week just to make sure that there's enough time for them to work on the group presentations. The presentations ended up being recorded assessment because of the accessibility elements, and it's also easier for us to mark. I also ask students to generate their own group agreements. Group agreements, the jury is still out on how effective they are. There's some sort of literature there for those who are interested. But I ask them to construct it themselves rather than kind of like the ones I give them. So it kind of helped. And then I asked them to sign them. But also the one thing that I think was particularly useful was anonymous weekly check-ins, where I picked some random members from the team each week and I emailed them for anonymous feedback of how the group work is going. Because normally when the group work is ongoing and if something's not quite right, people feel like they're going to be the snitch one, or they're going to tell on the group. So that kind of helped facilitate some of those conversations earlier if some students were struggling. But ideally, group work, although it's valuable for employability skills, it's very hard to do. So I hope to reduce it somehow in the future moving forward. Midpoint student feedback was quite good. So these are some of the questions that I pulled. So they were quite good. Overall module rating could have been higher, but I think there was some assessment we had 2 assessments due on the same day, and I think some students were not particularly happy with that. So some students found that they like the split between the online and then in-person hands-on structure. Other people didn't like the online lectures. And then a lot of the students like the multiple choice questions that help to reinforce learning. So a lot of these sort of scaffolding techniques that I've been adapting were quite useful. And then leading on to that, we had additional things. So fidget toys and seminars. So we have been doing my colleagues in the University of Exeter psychology department been doing quite a lot of work around fidget toys and seminars, and these are freely available for the lecturers to take into their seminars, and they were really useful for students, neurodivergent or not. I also used lecture summaries. So each lecture was summarized alongside the lecture slides, which a lot of students felt useful. For online lectures, the good thing about online lectures is you can have nice transcripts because you run them over Teams. So that was useful, again, for the recordings. I also included tick lists around weekly guidance of what they need to do. So it could be as simple as you need to attend this lecture, you need to attend seminar, you need to read this, and you need to read that. And we had, again, like I had a separate tick list for the reading list as well. And students really engaged with this because it gives them the sort of sense of completion when they go through the tick list. And it also then led into exploring FrameVR, because last year I couldn't attend the Island conference in person. So I assisted with the online conference, and I absolutely fell in love with FrameVR. And the Island virtual labs have launched. Jonathan, I think, has already shared about that a while ago. And we're going to try out FrameVR and accessibility, sort of several projects under the big, large umbrella around accessibility and the use of FrameVR. And I'm just started scratching the surface. We're using these sort of small little tasks for students and how they engaged with FrameVR. We didn't get to do too much other than these sort of small tasks. So there's a link here if you want to do the scavenger hunt with lily pads or the simple FrameVR environment that's actually free to use. You can use it for anybody. And if you want the slides for the FrameVR scavenger hunt, I can give them to you. It's quite a nice, fun little task for students to get used to the controls of how to use zoom in and zoom out from FrameVR. And it's a small frame, so it's kind of like a Zen garden that you can frolic in. But interestingly, we're going to have our revision session this Friday. So I haven't run the full session other than like a small tasks in FrameVR yet, but I'm hoping to report back somehow how the Friday revision session goes, because we're going to be using a larger frame, and that's going to be the first attempt for gather some sort of feedback from students around our virtual labs project. So it's hopefully will be quite exciting. So now, because we're in the last week, we got the official final student feedback. So as you can see, it's always quite good. Great to see that regardless. I know that there's still a lot of work to do. Some people will just leave it at this, but I'm sure we can get even better at engaging students. So a lot of students would find that just very useful. And what I think I found most interesting is where students expressed how they never actually learned anything similar before. So they never even thought of virtual reality potentially as a research tool for psychology, despite the fact that we have so many researchers in our university doing work around virtual reality and psychology. So again, it's very beneficial for students to learn these skills because it's useful for their employability. There are some obviously things that were not necessarily that favorable. So some lectures were a bit convoluted. So this is where we had this interdisciplinarity comes into play. So the UX UI lecture was a bit difficult, and we had someone who's not from STEM field, which was from humanities, talk about their work, and students found that very difficult to bridge that knowledge gap. As a lecturer, I find like a lot of interdisciplinary work really exciting, but I've been thinking in an interdisciplinary way for years, and I can see how students struggle. And I think this is a way for us to maybe work on some more interdisciplinary modules, given that moving forward in higher education specifically, it's likely to be more interdisciplinary anyways. So again, with some cases, I think in Glasgow, we try to contain it to mostly a couple of key lecturers, not have too many guest lecturers. This time around, I had more guest lecturers, mostly because it gave me a chance to get used to find out about more work in the University of Exeter around VR, but it felt a little bit disjointed, regardless that the fact that some topics were quite similar. So again, we need to find some sort of a middle ground there. So a bit of a summary of everything I talked about so far around the modules, and then I have a few more slides. So we had University of Glasgow. Strengths again, this is where we established the sort of foundations, case studies, VR labs, and design workshop, or some sort of consolidation workshop or group work design. We did have some challenges on technical difficulty, and maybe we needed some sort of synthesized reading. And then there was some challenges with assessment. Although in the second year in iteration, we kind of enhanced with more scaffolding, like weekly MCQs. We did start kind of put together the textbook and some more worksheets and mind maps that students can use. And then it seemed to sector impact has been growing, so more interest in expanding these type of work. And I think it just shows the recognition that we need to upskill psychology students more. And then again, I put level 4 undergraduate. So in Exeter, we had different structure. Assessment was again different. The challenges were over-assessment, but it's something that we're working throughout the entire department faculty to change that next year. But the future plan, I want to implement FrameVR much more than we got a chance to do in this. So whenever you run the course for the first time in the new institution, there's a lot more other sort of logistical challenges. But next iteration, I'm hoping to do more FrameVR research, given again that we're doing the virtual labs work. And then I want to replace exam with accessibility analysis assessment. So try to set up some individual frames where students can assess accessibility of the different specific tasks. this would be more in line with this authentic assessment discussions people been having, because we want to try to find assessments that are not sort of AI resistant, if you like. We don't want to just get tons of essays that are written by large language models. So around VR pedagogy, so this is my attempt trying to kind of summarize the challenges, because we have the technology and immersive methods that are important. Then we have psychology, theory, research skills that are just equally important. And then we have this interdisciplinary thinking and employability, and trying to kind of weave it into something that's pedagogically well informed and structured, and to develop this sort of interdisciplinary VR literacy in students, it's quite challenging. I'm hoping we so far seems to have done a good enough job that students are enjoying the course, but there's still a lot more to be done in terms of not just improving the course, but also trying to put together maybe even like I'm hoping this presentation is going to be a first step in terms of how these modules can be structured and serve as an example or a template of what people can take away and implement elsewhere. And I am hoping to write maybe a paper or a blog post about this. So stay tuned. Maybe something will come out soon when I come out of teaching and have some time to think about it. So moving forward, I'm thinking of more personalized support. So I've been starting to think about custom chatbots. I've got a few webinars coming up around this. And in higher education, at least in the UK, there's been so much discussion around these AI tutors. I included some literature around this, where it can enhance engagement and accessibility. We can also then control what resources those chatbots use so they don't go rogue, and then they don't have, again, any hallucinations. But I did find myself sort of struggling with some of the sort of more straightforward setups. So this at the bottom here is the ChatGPT one for a different course I'm trialing in. And it was a little bit, because I've got ChatGPT Pro license, was much more customizable, but universities, at least in the UK, prefer anything under the Microsoft 365 license. So I tried Copilot, Professor XR, which I somehow, my nerdiness really liked the naming the AI chatbot that, and I think I might keep it. But I don't like the Copilot output because it seems to still get things wrong. So I have a feeling it will need to be maybe something that's very much custom made with our IT team, which is much more uphill battle than trying to use a custom AI chatbot from just directly Copilot, which you can just create quite quickly. So there's some, again, the jury is still out in terms of what the educators think about the custom chatbots. I think there's no harm in trying them, because students that I talk to so far are pretty cautious on AI anyways. But again, we'll see maybe in the next year. I presume there's going to be much more literature around AI use and chatbots as well, I'm sure. So we'll see how that goes. So just again, a bit more of summary. So I just placed, again, psychology in itself, I think it lends itself as an interdisciplinary field. And then when you attach VR, I think it becomes quite rich in terms of what you can teach and how nicely you can structure this. And also the challenges, although they are specifically linked to psychology and VR modules I talked about, it also reflects some broader issues in interdisciplinary teaching. And interdisciplinarity is something that higher education institutions at least have been preaching for years, but whether it's in practice, that's another question. I think the challenge with anything interdisciplinary is balancing breadth and with depth, managing cognitive demands on just the sheer amount of information the students are getting, but also they need to have enough space to link this information together. And then developing these transferable skills and ensuring inclusive learning environments. So there's a lot on the instructor, perhaps, to try to facilitate this. And so I think it's just, again, trying to use the sort of research-informed pedagogical practices, which is why I try to pepper some useful literature you can go and look at, because the decisions you're making in the way you structure the course should be informed by research, not just chucking tons of VR related content and some headsets and hope students are going to piece it together themselves. So future directions, again, I mentioned removal of group assessment, adoption of FrameVR of teaching and revision more widely, development of VR accessibility analytic, just a little bit more work around that, stronger integration of case studies. So again, finding more explicit links maybe. Continued refinement of open textbook. Again, that's something that I spoke to Matthew about because he's already running the course on something that's similar. So maybe we'll try to collaborate and get some other people on board. And then again, most importantly, building an evidence base for VR pedagogy and psychology, because it's again even more niche than VR pedagogical work in general. But it's so far most of the work that we have on immersive education is about teaching in virtual reality, but we don't really have anything that talks about interdisciplinarity and how teaching about VR is just as challenging. And then just general conclusions. I think I already kind of mirrors, I think I already kind of mentioned all of this. But just a little summary slide for you. But I'm hoping it was quite interesting talk. You got a link to my website and my email for those who want to get in touch and the long reference list. But again, I can leave the slide for a bit, but I would like to see if there's any questions or anything that I can talk about. So maybe I'll stop sharing and leave it at that.
Thank you, Sarune. Wow, what fantastic. Every single time you present, I'm so impressed by you just
Oh,
have
thank
such a
you.
the full view of connecting research and practice, and you put it into such an incredible package. It's just really well delivered, and you're so
Thank you
thoughtful, and I'm a big fan, as you know. So um,
so much. I really try to make sure it makes sense because it makes sense in my head, but then when you start putting it on the slides, but it was actually, I think, because I was so passionate about this, it was made life so much easier because putting slides together, as I'm sure everyone knows, it's much easier when you know the topic, but you're also very keen to share the insights of what you've done.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you've done so much and you put it all into such a great presentation for us all. So yeah, we do have a couple of questions here
Oh,
if I could
cool.
sort of I have things I want to talk about too, but I want to give our audience thank you for coming to this session and
Yes.
um Guillermo Nieto said, in what cases should VR research for education? In what other cases is it better to use another technology? And he's asking, because it isn't clear where VR, AR, or XR could create more impact on education. So where can I find that textbook? And I
Yeah. So,
responded, I gave him Chris Deedy's
yes.
2009 Science Journal article, which kind of taps
Yes.
into that. But I know you've got more to say on that for sure.
So I'm gonna just get that Git book. But yeah, I think it's actually quite complex topic. So in terms of, I think, in terms of what cases are, I think the students actually in all of the iterations of the course, by within those 10, 12 weeks, they develop actually quite good critical evaluation of where VR is suitable and where it isn't.
Mhm.
That's what the critical review assignment essentially is designed to do for them. So I keep saying to them, the criticality essentially in your review will be where you talk about, is it a good use of the hour or is it not? Because we know that not, there's a lot of papers out there. There's some that are just good feasibility studies and they might not go anywhere. And in some cases, there's just obvious use for VR. For example, exposure therapy in psychology, we know that's just has mountains of evidence that it's just very effective. Although
Right.
that means that I read an enormous amount of critical reviews on that topic, so it's a little bit repetitive for me to mark. But that also kind of shows that criticality that students actually develop. But I think that's again sort of that question of where, how do we know what we research next is by creating the next generation of researchers essentially through
Mhm.
these type of coursework, courses and modules who actually are thinking critically interdisciplinary and applying their psychology knowledge outside of just psychology essentially.
Mhm.
But I'm going to put a link to the Git book that, again, you can quote it and reference it, and it's going to keep updating as we.
Yeah. Oh, that's so exciting. And you know, the as you know, Sharuna and others that you know, I learn is dedicated towards trying to
Yeah.
collect and create the evidence around what works in immersive learning. And it is very complex and very um,
Mm.
very evolving and changing and even as, you know, we're trying to define it in some cases. I was struck so much by your presentation with, you know, the deep integration with psychology and then relating that kind of to the learning sciences, like that the psychology of VR and the psychology of how people learn and understanding ways to apply cognition and behavior and all the things that have come out of psychology or coming out of
Yeah.
psychology, and that is so important. So I really am excited to take a look at this GitHub textbook. And
Yeah, it's still, work in progress, but I think again it can be difficult. So I'm just trying to read the comments as well. I can see
yeah,
that Guillermo also said that some people that they found that some people with psychology background have difficulty thinking how to apply these theories into XR, which is again,
yes,
that's again sort of just I think it's just shifting something in your thinking because this is what I'm doing in the course. But this is why when I mentioned the UI UX was a great example. So it's a colleague that we work together in Edify, and she's a UI UX designer. And it was interesting the collaboration we had because a lot of UI UX designers generally come from instructional design background or design background.
right,
So we used to have constant conversations where she used to ask me psychology and behavioral information. And I'm just love talking psychology, so I could talk every day. But now she's actually upskilling and taking an open university course in
mhm,
psychology because she realized how important it is for UX design. So
right,
she and talk to students. But it was really interesting. Again, I think like my brain immediately thinks interdisciplinary. So I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be so valuable for students. But then students came to me in the class after and said, could you like summarize that class again? Because I don't quite understand what it was about. Because I think they needed that almost like translation from,
yeah,
and I kept kind of saying, like, you already know this, it's just called different.
right,
But it's just you need that gap to for them to like kind of really for it to click in.
mhm,
So this Friday, I'm gonna try to do some infographics for them to say, in UX we say this, but in psychology we mean that, just to
right,
make sure it kind of all comes together. Because I think for years an undergraduate for any discipline, you're so specialized in some sort of a field. So then when interdisciplinary module comes along, it doesn't have to be this in any interdisciplinary module. It's going to be difficult for students to kind of shift that gear and sort of think, oh, there's other ways to refer to things and I can think
yeah,
outside the box where we've been pigeonholing them into that box the entire 3 years. Now we're kind of saying like, there's no box, you're free, and then they don't know what to do. So
that's yeah, that's so true. Yeah, the interdisciplinary piece of it, of bridging these different, you know, languages and conferences and the use of different disciplinary language to talk about the same phenomena with totally different language, and
yeah,
that putting you're in a box disciplinary wise, and even if the things that you're using in examples are accessible and understood by them, just the fact that you're sort of introducing games within serious work or
yeah,
colliding these things together sometimes is so hard for people's
yeah,
frames to shift. But yeah,
yeah, definitely. because we have so many sessions where we get them into like, so we have the two practical sessions. The first one is like free play. So we give them like tons of games and
Mhm.
like different things that they can try. And then the second one is much more structured. So we go through all of these like immersive education scenarios, which tends to be kind of like well developed, and it's a bit more quiet in the room when they do that.
Right.
But it's interesting when even after the sort of play sessions, when they say, well, we tried this on the computer and then we tried it in VR, and they can compare the differences between the. So again, I give them a worksheet, but sometimes if for those, it's not to say that all students, we always have the keen beans and then not so keen beans.
Yeah.
But the ones who are engaged with the content, they normally immediately start getting a sense of like, how is that going to benefit my learning?
Yeah.
And then they enjoy their time, but they also start thinking like, oh, what does that mean? And yeah, but you need to kind of try to facilitate it as well, I think, as an instructor.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, to your credit again, like you've done these workshops at iLearn multiple times, and the way you deliver your presentations, it makes it accessible so that these unfamiliar ideas that are colliding together in space and people are going, what? Like you really scaffold and make that,
Yeah.
you can just tell in your course design how well you've done that. So
Yeah,
that's,
well, thank you. Well, I see that Guillermo also says that whether there's a language, common language could solve the problem. I think like I think there is I've taught a transdisciplinary science. Don't ask me what the difference between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary is because there's so many something disciplinary definitions. I don't know. But I taught this course for PhD students who were working between computer science and psychology. And I think that was just one lecture, and it seemed like I don't think there's like a general practice. I think normally what researchers tend to do is just like sit down together with collaborators and say, um, well, can we just like make sure we're on the same page with these definitions? And then you just leave it at that. But I think like what would be a common language? I think that's a good idea, but I don't know what there must be something within maybe humanities that's done something around like bridging the languages.
yeah.
That kind of talks maybe a bit about that.
Yeah. I just put in chat too, like if you go back to the 1980s when physical
Ah,
therapy became a discipline, right? From the physics and the anatomy side, from the coaching and rehabilitation side, and from the therapy, psychological piece too, that all came together. And that's where I got this idea of the circle of scholars, because there's different people coming from different perspectives that are all looking at the same phenomenon, but with different types of expertise. And then even before that, like when history kind of created, like, this is our field of inquiry. This is the methods that we use when we study history. These are the questions that we answer. Um, so I think multiple times in the past that there's been this circling of a phenomenon by different kinds of expertise, and then struggling or working or figuring out a way to use common language and define the boundaries and guidelines for what it is that we're studying. And that's what we're trying to do with iLearn, is contribute to that interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary conversation. Yeah.
pick up any questions I might have missed. Um,
There was
so
somebody looking that you were very helpful in helping them to develop their master's degree capstone
yeah, I
and
saw that. So feel
resources.
free. I'm happy for people to reach out if you want to have any chat about developing the course and if anything would be helpful because I've done this now in two universities with two different systems, although within UK. So I'm happy to chat about that. So feel free to reach out on anything related. I'm always happy to chat about the course. I think Kavi was asking about the funding, but I think that really depends on where you're based. And Chloe was asking about the use of
Tools.
platforms to develop something in VR.
Yeah.
But I think now with AI, I find that it's much easier. You can troubleshoot with AI. So anything you've got like courses, you can just you can ask questions with AI and it gives you some advice. if you don't mind using AI, because I know some people ethically don't want to use it.
Mhm.
But I find it very helpful because I use a lot of programming languages for data analysis, and AI is just my best friend now. I haven't given them a name yet, which maybe I should think about. Um, but it's become my best friend in terms of debugging because
Yeah.
I used to do it by hand and it used to take me like a half a day and 10 years of my life to find a typo somewhere in the code,
Right.
where now with AI it just takes me a couple of hours. So
Yeah.
it's just the time it saves me. It's incredible, and it's just useful for some other things too. But I think debugging is something where it doesn't get things wrong. I find with other things you need to double check, but with coding, I think that's what it's made for essentially, isn't it? So yeah,
That's definitely one of the proven use cases is doing that.
yeah.
Although the vibe coding thing, there's lots to go into like whether or not that is a wise approach. But yeah.
I think sometimes if you don't preset some of the stuff, so I've because I do it for analysis of data,
Mhm.
it has gotten some data analysis wrong from get-go because I didn't check how it was wrangling the data. So you
Yeah.
still need to keep an eye on it. It's not perfect, but for bugging rather than statistics, it's certainly good. But I'm
Right.
gonna also put my website and OSF page
Oh
with all
yeah.
the resources in the chat just to make sure people have that.
Oh, good deal.
Um, but always, I updated my website, so it should be up to date more or less, I think.
And for those of you watching the recording on our iLearn YouTube channel, we'll be sure to drop the links to Sarune's, Dr. Savickaite's links to her website and the resources that she shared during this session as well. So, and thank you for watching and clicking
Yes,
subscribe and liking. Got
thanks
to
so
plug that.
much. Yeah, I know my surname is quite crazy, so I'm trying to adapt Dr. Sarune because I thought I'll go with one name to make life easier for everyone. So I'm trying to adapt that a little bit more. But
Okay. Well, yeah,
to
I like
see if
practicing it, and yeah, like, yeah, I think your name is awesome. So,
I know it's a very unusual, and I have like a 400 student cohort next semester, so I'll need to make sure that I thought I'll go with Dr. S or something. I don't know.
right.
I'll think of something.
You deserve a superhero name, I think, my friend.
I hope so.
Yeah,
But
right.
it's a lot of
Um,
work still needs to be done, but I love my work, which helps. So, of
well, we will stay in touch, and hopefully we'll have you back on for another
course,
webinar soon. We're
anytime.
over the hour here, but I wanted to thank you again so much. Thank you, Dr. S, for coming and presenting and sharing so much of your knowledge and your progress. Everyone, that wraps up our session, and we will post the links again in our YouTube session. And thank you for supporting the Immersive Learning Research Network. All right. Bye, everyone.